Hello, everyone. It is time for speaker number 10 at Markna 2023. Our sponsor for this hour, I mean, he's a sponsor for the whole show, is Marco Rocks. So if you haven't bought any raffle tickets yet, that money is going to the Coral Restoration Foundation. We've raised over $5,000 so far. I'm super excited. I actually thought we'd get 2 or 3. So the fact that we're at 5 now and we still have 14 hours ahead is amazing. And let's hope it just keeps coming in. Marco Rocks has been making rocks for you guys for the aquarium structure for a very long time. And now they've just recently released some new rock that looks like coralline. Completely safe, completely inert, not paint, not dye. Really neat stuff. And holds the color. It doesn't fade away, which is really interesting too. So I wanted to make sure to tell you guys that. I thank you so much for sticking with us hour after hour. I do want to mention that we have no power here. But we are on a generator, and we've put ice in the aquariums to cool them down because the house is so hot. So here is Dr. Douglas Fenner, who is, well, I'm going to let him introduce himself because he will do a far better job than I will.
Okay, yeah. You can probably tell by my accent, I'm originally from the States, but I did work for 6 years at Ames, same place the previous presenter was. It was a much smaller place then, and I think it's really great to hear that Australia is investing in trying to save reefs the way it is. I, however, am currently part of an extremely small program that NOAA, the U.S. federal government's National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, has on coral, teaching people how to identify corals in the Pacific. Basically, corals are sufficiently diverse in the Pacific and sufficiently variable in their looks and their structure that they're hard to identify. They're easy in the Caribbean. There's only about 65 species there that are known. And currently, there's probably at least 750 known in the Indo-Pacific. And we know that there's lots more that we don't have names on yet.
Wow.
So it's extremely challenging. And it will actually continue to be challenging well into the future. And NOAA's interest comes from the fact that the U.S. government has delegated the problem of administering a law called the U.S. Endangered Species Act to NOAA. For organisms on land, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service administers the Endangered Species Act. And that includes things like listing species and enforcing the law. NOAA has much less problem. There are many fewer species that are known to be either already extinct or in immediate danger of extinction in the Indo-Pacific. And the U.S. is actually a pretty small player in terms of reef area. So Australia and Indonesia have the 2 largest areas of coral reefs of any countries in the world, about 16% each, and the Philippines has about 8%, and the U.S. is down the list, maybe at number 15 or 20, something like that. And you know, in the Pacific, the U.S. has Hawaii, Guam, the Marianas, and American Samoa, plus a few little very remote islands between American Samoa and Hawaii. So the U.S. is a small player, and as the coral taxonomy currently has been, and up to this point, coral species, as they're defined morphologically, have large ranges. There's a fair number of them, actually, that have a range between Eastern Africa and the Eastern Pacific. And that is basically, the Indo-Pacific is the largest area of organisms on the planet, with the possible exception of the deep sea substrate. Abyssal plains are extremely large. And all the species in the Caribbean are different from the ones in the Indo-Pacific, except about 3 of them that have been introduced into the Caribbean. So the problem with extinction is that it is permanent. As far as we know, up to this point, there are groups working on trying to figure out how to revive extinct species, but it's probably going to be quite expensive, and it's probably cheaper to avoid extinction in the first place. And given the number of species that could be endangered, avoiding extinction is a better solution. And it fits with the old saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, let's see, something like that. So NOAA has an interest that has been heightened by the fact that we all now know that coral reefs are in grave danger. They're not as badly impacted so far in the Pacific, particularly, as they are in the Caribbean and Florida. I live and work in American Samoa, and I often say that American Samoa has reefs that Florida that are healthy enough that Florida would die to have reefs that healthy.
Wow.
Um, it's hugely different, and I travel around the Pacific, and I've seen a lot of reefs that are still in fine condition, basically. However, it's well illustrated by the fact that here in the Samoan archipelago, the next island west of American Samoa, which is in independent Samoa, has had 90% of its corals killed. And we
Okay.
don't even really know for sure what did it. They have essentially no resources, no ability to do the kinds of things that Australia is doing, or even something much more modest. And that's a big problem. We need to know which species are in trouble, not just which places on reefs,
Yeah.
at least for the problem of extinction, because extinction occurs at the species level. And that's why the law is the U.S. Endangered Species Act and not a Endangered Genus Act or Family Act or ta-da, larger taxonomic groups than species. But species are very tough to identify, and that leads to identifications being very uncertain,
Yeah.
which is not good. And we need to know how individual species are doing so that we can better uh, evaluate the risk in the future. And even scientists have significant difficulties identifying corals to species. And so there's a fair literature, scientific literature on corals that only identifies them to genus, and even some that identify it to species don't give you the background needed to know to basically make it transparent so you can check their identifications. And identifications are often faulty. And I'll be the first to admit that my identifications are not perfect by any means. I try to be up to date with the current level, but we know that there are many mistakes in the system at the present, and they're all going to have to be worked through.
Uh-huh.
So, anyhow, NOAA didn't have enough information, basically, when a petition arrived to list something like 68 species of corals under the Endangered Species Act. And they had to make a decision whether there was enough information, and they evaluated them. They ended up thinking there was enough information to do some. But part of the problem is that if studies list species by genus and the information is by genus, their individual species within the genus may be quite different. And in fact, there is hard evidence that, for instance, bleaching, which is the major future threat for corals,
Yeah.
affects different species within a genus
Hmm.
very differently. Some are much more sensitive, some are much less. And we need much more of that kind of information.
Mhm.
So NOAA basically came up with the idea that, hey, maybe we could help try to train people a bit better on how to identify corals. And such information is not widespread. And most of the countries that have coral reefs, of course, they're in the tropics, do not have the financial resources to do what Australia is doing. And it's great that somebody is doing it. Even the U.S., to my knowledge, is not doing projects anywhere near as large as we just heard about, which is fantastic,
Yeah.
in my opinion. So the idea came to NOAA that maybe we could help train some people to build capacity to identify corals. And there are quite a few places with coral reef monitoring programs. And if they could monitor at the species level, that would greatly improve our information level, because I think it's my personal opinion, and not NOAA's policy or anything like that, that many corals are going to become endangered, or at least threatened in the future. Um, the Act defines endangered as being presently in danger of extinction, and threatened as being uh, that you can reasonably project that in the foreseeable future they will become endangered. And most of the species they've listed, they only have listed something like 20 in the Pacific, and it's actually less than 20, it's about 15, that they listed them all as threatened. A second petition listed 3 as endangered. And the species can be anywhere in the world, but the petitioner has to be a U.S. citizen or a U.S. organization. So anyhow, that gives you a background. When I was first asked, could I help out with this, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, trying to teach people how to identify coral species, that's like near impossible. And then I remembered having seen someone who was studying fish species.
Mm-hmm.
And on their computer, they had a picture of a fish, but no name.
Mm-hmm.
They pushed the button to the next slide in the PowerPoint,
Yeah.
and the name suddenly appeared.
Uh-huh.
It's basically like flashcards,
Mm-hmm.
and it teases the person to try to identify it. If they don't, they can immediately find out whether they're right or wrong.
Yeah.
And that actually leads them to have an understanding of how they're doing. Are they doing pretty well? Are they doing, they need more work? And so what I do is I go to a place, I photograph corals like crazy, and then I build a field guide. And I build it in Word, and then I make a PDF out of it.
Mm-hmm.
One advantage is that the picture of the coral can be the full screen of a large screen if you want to.
Right.
And that helps a lot. You were asking about what we use for identification, and there's sort of 2 major groups of things that I like to have to help me. And one is the shape of a whole colony.
Okay.
So traditionally in a museum, there are pieces of corals.
Yeah.
And that's what's been studied. And you can put them under the microscope and see the tiny things, but you often don't know what the shape of the whole colony looks like,
Right.
unless the original description tells you, or somebody has pictures. Basically, the original description and the type specimen are the arbiters. They are the final arbiter of how the name is implied. And there's 2 aspects. One is the name. We humans make them up. It's a game.
Right.
There's a rule book. You can play the game, and you need to play it by the rule book if you want to win. And winning is when you describe a new species, and people use that name. And we need to all be talking about the same thing when we use a name, so that when somebody speaks or writes the name, other people know what they're talking about and aren't misled and think it's something else. So the other aspect is the actual biology of the actual organisms. And the living corals actually are not what the taxonomy is based on. It's based on their skeleton.
Uh-huh.
But the skeleton is directly related to the tissue. And it has all the features. They're hard. As long as nobody crunches them, they can sit in a museum for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
As long as they don't have too much dust on them, they're perfectly good.
Yeah.
If you have to work with anemones, when anemone is put into preservative, it scrunches up, it contracts up, and it's a total mess to try to figure out what it is. Whereas the skeletons don't do that.
Uh-huh.
So it's based on skeletons, but often we don't have much information about what the whole colony is. My opinion is the whole colony gives you things that help you, and also the things under the microscope, the medium down to tiny things, the shapes of the polyp cups called corallites, and all the little details of all the spines and stuff, which I won't go into because it's way too long. And when I teach people, I'm teaching them what the living coral looks like.
Right.
And the tissue actually gets in the way of that.
Yes.
Occasionally, it helps with the coral being a different color, but color isn't usually very helpful.
Yeah.
So we are limited when we're in the water looking at living corals. And in fact, it's my opinion that when we identify a living coral, it's actually a guess. It's
Yeah.
actually not a secure identification.
Yeah.
We want it to be the best educated guess possible, but we have to check the skeletons from time to time to see if we're right. So, and the latest thing is DNA, and there's new methods with DNA
Yeah.
that are more powerful and are doing a better job of distinguishing at the species level.
Hmm.
The first method, PCR, seems to work really good at the long term, the evolutionary tree um, that of how they evolve,
Yeah.
but is not as powerful as it needs to be with some species. So anyhow,
Yeah.
um, but I try to get through all that to get the species as correct as I can to people.
Yeah.
And I built these little I call them practice modules,
Hmm.
where the first slide is a coral, and I hit the button, and then the name appears.
Hmm.
And in a workshop, I basically first present, say, maybe 10 or 5 or 10 different genera, and then I do a practice module, and I ask the participants to tell me what the genus is.
Hmm.
And then when I do species, same thing with that.
Right.
And I can see how well they're doing.
Hmm.
And my goal is for them to be very accurate and get it right.
Yeah.
That's the whole purpose of the thing. And they'll need to practice to get better and better at it, and then get in the water and practice in the water.
Right.
So we've been doing that for several years. We had an interruption with the pandemic, but initially we went just to the U.S. areas in the Pacific. Then the next year we added the countries called freely associated states, basically in Micronesia. They're independent countries, but they're associated with the United States and have agreements for support from the United States. So we added those, and since then we've added more. And in the North Pacific, last time I did 9 stops, about a week each, and
Hmm.
then there's about 6 or 7 stops in the South Pacific, and we're always trying to expand. And we offer all this for free. It's all supported by NOAA. I'm only on a one third time, and I'm the only person who does it.
Yeah.
Contrast that with what Australia is doing. Huge facilities,
Right.
boats, huge numbers of people
Yeah.
and stuff.
People
And
that Kevin hasn't even met.
yeah,
It's so
right.
many, he hasn't met them all, and he's been there how
That's
long, you
right.
know?
That's right. And that's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
But so our program is very small, and but we're doing what we can.
Do you get paid
So,
for your work? That what you're doing, is that a
oh
paid
yes,
gig? Okay. All
oh
right.
yes, yeah. They pay all my travel expenses. They
Nice.
pay me for my time. I'm paid hourly. Uh huh.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
and that's how we manage the one third time.
Yeah.
Um, so
15
yeah,
years ago, every time someone would post a picture of a coral and say, "I got this at the fish store. What is it?" The most annoying, accurate answer I saw was, "We don't know until you put it in a cup of bleach." That's all they ever said. And I was like, you guys, and you're going to kill it to identify it. You're driving me bonkers. I
yeah,
mean, you said
yeah.
we looking at the skeleton, looking at DNA. Yeah, we can kind of really boil it down. But I felt like, certain acros we kind of know. But there are a lot of acrophora. So, and like
That's
you
right.
said, we've probably gotten some wrong ones along the line too. And then, of course, the nicknames make it even worse.
It's a sure bet.
Yeah.
There's no question. There are lots of mistakes. Um, for those who are interested in learning a bit more and just going online,
Hmm.
um, the guides that I've built are on NOAA's website. And I think probably if you go on to NOAA's website and then search for something like Coral Identification Workshop,
Uh huh.
there are 3 pages about our program, the pop up. And actually, you can download the guides
Yes.
to most of the places I've been.
Yeah.
Um, and for the few others, we'll have those posted hopefully fairly soon.
Nice.
Another resource is a project called Corals of the World,
Mm-hmm.
which is led by a guy popularly named Charlie Varon.
Right.
Actually, Jen,
Yeah.
John Elward Norwood
I
variant.
never knew that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I once was asked by somebody, "Are they brothers or something?" No, it's one person,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and he's the one I used to work for 6 years
Yeah.
in Ames in Australia.
Hmm.
He's still in Australia. He's now independent,
Hmm.
and he now has a website.
Hmm.
He did publish in 2000 a 3-volume
Right.
series called Corals of the World.
Yeah.
Huge thing. And the problem for any small place in the Pacific is that only a fraction of those corals will be present there. And among those that are present, probably the majority will be rare.
Hmm.
It's typical in highly diverse ecosystems for most of the species to be relatively rare and
Hmm.
only a few of them common. And so, do you really want to page through 831 species of corals to try to find the 20 species that you see commonly at your location? And my guides are smaller. They only use pictures from the location,
Yeah.
archipelago that the guide applies
Yeah.
to. And so, if you're looking at them, you know that every picture looks like a coral at that location,
Yeah.
and that you don't have to leaf through lots of things that aren't there
Right.
or you can't find because they're too rare.
Yeah.
So hopefully that helps. And a lot of my work is to try to make something that is a very difficult thing to do, learn to identify corals as species, into small steps. Steps that are small enough, they're not too hard to do. And all you have to do is be interested and motivated and persistent.
Hmm.
And if you do the work, in about 3 days, I can teach people how to identify up to half of all the species where they live.
Hmm.
And it's taken me 35 years to learn what I know,
Right.
and I still don't know lots. And there's a lot more to come
Let
that
me
no
ask you
one.
something. Do you, I mean, I know how I feel. Do you hate it when, you believe something was something like this and they tell you, nope, now it's this? Does that bother you? Because I hate it when they're saying, this is no longer an acan, now it's a micromusa. I mean, I know it's a silly thing to argue about. But do you
No,
care? Or do you just like, nope,
no.
I'm fine with that?
Yes. And in fact, the rule book, which is agreed among taxonomists, there's an organization,
Yeah.
and you can freely access it for free on the web.
Hmm.
It's called the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature.
Oh, okay.
And there's a commission of experts, and it's almost like a constitution and Supreme Court or
Uh huh.
a Bible and a Pope or something like
Wow.
that
Yeah, yeah,
for
yeah.
trying to figure out what is correct.
Okay.
And one of the highest goals, the greatest goals of that code, which was built over 250 years of practice with species,
Hmm.
is stability of nomenclature,
Uh huh.
precisely for what you're pointing to.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there are all sorts of reasons, I won't get into the details, that force us to do this sort of thing.
Okay.
The basic rule, the most basic rule is priority. Whatever the first correct name applied, applies.
Hmm.
And later ones that are applied to the same species
Hmm.
are incorrect. They're called junior synonyms. However, that depends on the taxonomic judgment that they're the same species.
Hmm.
And people don't realize it. People think that the code forces everyone to use this name instead of that name.
Uh huh.
In fact, that only occurs if you also think that the two are the same species. But remember, each coral looks different. Every single coral
Yeah.
colony looks different from every other single colony.
Yeah.
And it's a royal pain to figure out which groups of corals constitute species
Yeah.
and which are variants within the species and which are differences between species.
Hmm.
And that's largely been done on the basis of expert opinion based on experience.
Hmm.
Now DNA is coming along, and the newer method, which is also being done led by people in James Cook University in Australia, right next to Ames, basically.
Hmm.
Um, and that method now is showing that a fair number of species, quite a lot of the coral species, are actually composed of several species each. And some of them already have names
Yeah.
that have been synonymized in mistake and error,
Okay.
and others are new species. And they're estimating these days that the total number of species will eventually be about 3 times what it is currently. So it'll be 2,400 roughly.
Wow. Really?
And that's probably not even accurate to the 100. And that's just based on so far.
Wow.
And they're starting out with Acropora, which is the largest genus.
Okay.
But that's a huge project.
It's one of my
Actually,
favorites.
it's going to take decades
Yeah.
to get to more stability.
Yeah.
But it drives me crazy too. It
Okay.
does everybody.
All right, good.
But
Yeah, I don't know if I'm just being stubborn or like,
no,
no, I always knew it was this. I hate when they change it.
I know with me it's being stubborn,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
But as a scientist, when the evidence is there and it shows the best available current scientific evidence, even the Endangered Species Act, as part of the law, says it must be based on the best current available scientific evidence.
Mhm.
So when better evidence comes along, we have to change.
Yeah.
And I've been changing, but it's a painful process
Okay.
for everybody.
Okay.
And most people are going to wonder, why the heck do you have to change that name all the time? And most of the time, it's just because some new evidence has come along, and DNA is the one that's now going to be driving a lot of the changes. And
Yeah.
I think it's going to take at least 2 decades, maybe more. It's not going to happen right away,
So
but it's already
DNA
started.
wouldn't make it easier. I mean, I don't know anything. I don't know anything but my tiny bit of DNA I learned back in the day. So it's a code. I mean, it's the chain, but they can't just say you've got 70 chains now. We know there's 70, and that's it. I mean, it's not that simple. No.
To my knowledge, people are not yet applying to corals for taxonomy purposes,
Yeah.
sequencing the entire genome. Once it gets to that point, that's the end point. You can't do more than the entire genome of both the host coral and of the zooxanthellae
Yeah.
and the mitochondria. And some of the early DNA stuff has all been, not been part of it, sequencing. Some of the genes are in mitochondria and some of them are in the nuclear genome. But I'm 75, and my biology training was 50 years ago, over 50 years ago. It was at the undergraduate level.
Yeah.
And so, I don't understand the DNA stuff either. So we're all going to be do some struggling along the way. There's no
Okay.
question about it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Do we want to try and show a little piece of your workshop?
Yep.
Do we have
I think
can we do that?
it's good now to start the. I just have a few slides,
Yeah.
and that'll
I'll put this
hopefully
on the
reinforce it a
screen.
bit better.
And what else do I have to do here? I guess that's all I got to do. And then you just tell me next slide, and I just
Yeah, go ahead to the next slide.
okay.
So this is the first page of my field guide to the corals of the Samoan archipelago, which is where I live. And there's a couple of pictures of living corals there. It's difficult to put in PowerPoint what a PDF looks like, so it's only part of the
Yeah.
page.
No, we get it. We get it.
But now, okay, so let's go to the next one.
Okay.
And here's the beginning of the description for one species, happens to be Possilopora varicosa. And basically, I try to describe what the species looks like and then talk about how it's different from other similar corals.
Yeah.
Because to identify a coral, you need to know how it differs from other ones that look similar.
Right.
That's where, it gets difficult often. And so that's the kind of description I do. I actually have similar descriptions for the genus, for the family, for the order, for the, all up to level to the phylum Cnidaria, which is the anemones, corals, jellyfish, and all their relatives.
Yeah.
So let's go to the next slide, but go ahead and ask questions as you think of them.
Well, actually, I was going to tell you a story because it's this coral. I took these pictures. Now, you took this where you took it, but I took pictures of something that looked like this in Hawaii, and I just asked my friends on Facebook, hey, what coral is this? And everyone, of course, said, Mark, that's Possilopora. And I'm like, no, it's not, because I've grown Possilopora in my reef, and it never looks like that thing ever. But of course, I started from a frag and made a little tiny, cute little like broccoli head. It didn't have these big, thick, double branch looking nodules, or whatever you call that. And I was shocked that I didn't recognize something that was in my aquarium, just supersized. I would have thought I would know it, and I was actually arguing you're all wrong when I was completely wrong, of course. Go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, I think that's fairly typical, and that a part of the problem is that corals placed in aquaria are in a different environment. And environment does affect how corals, the shape of the colony as
Yeah,
it grows.
right.
And there's a picture that one scientist in Hawaii has from a tank in which a coral that looks like this has a little branch growing off that has very fine branches.
Uh huh.
And it's clearly the same coral
Yeah.
because they're connected. I mean, one is growing
Yeah.
from the other,
Right.
and yet they look like totally different species that are wildly different in the shape.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't necessarily happen all the time,
Right.
but it can happen. And corals in aquaria typically have inflated tissues. They're much fleshier than on the reef.
Yeah.
And that actually, if the layer of tissue is thick, it makes it more difficult unless that tissue is distinctive to
Right.
identify the species because we need the skeleton features to help us.
Yeah.
And as I often say, if you're trying to identify corals, you need all the help you can get. And
Yeah.
that's basically my job,
Yeah. Yeah.
is to try to help people with that problem.
Yeah.
So it's also true that corals on reefs have different microenvironments. So a coral that is in 1 foot depth water on the reef crest in heavy waves is in a very different environment than 100 feet deep, where
Sure.
the water light is much dimmer, there's almost no wave surge,
Right.
and on and on.
Yeah.
And there's at least one study of transplanting corals from one depth to another that
Hmm.
found that some corals didn't change with depth and
Huh.
others changed dramatically.
Oh, that's
So
neat.
there is no general rule, as far
Yeah.
as we know at this point, of how much contribution the environment has.
Yeah. Yeah.
One rule of thumb is if you're underwater and you see two corals right next to each other
Okay.
in the same light, the same wave
Yeah.
surge, and they look different,
Uh-huh.
then the difference is likely to be genetic.
Okay.
That doesn't mean they're different species.
Yeah.
That's a different question. But species are based on genetic, and they need to be sufficiently different genetically. And how you determine that is a heavy problem.
Hmm.
And DNA is definitely helping us with that at this point.
Well, I'm glad
Okay.
you're doing this and I'm not doing it. I don't think I have the patience for it.
Yes. And, not everybody can be dedicated for 35 or 40 years trying to learn this darn stuff.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to speed that process up and make it more accessible for people.
Right.
Yeah, let's go. And species are basically extremely important,
Uh huh.
not only from the point of view of endangered species, but from basic biology, because every species biology is different. If you treat humans like chimpanzees and vice versa, you're going to have some severe problems. We're not the same. We are wildly different. In fact, many people don't think we're this even both related animals. We're so different. And so species are super important for all biological studies that involve corals.
Yeah.
We need to be able to identify them accurately, and often scientists either can't or don't divulge, what they used to identify them, what the book was. Did they consult the original description, the pictures of type specimen? Virtually none of that. Oh, we just did it. And that's just not good enough. That's not good science. And
Well, you said-
unfortunately, it's done very widely. So we all need to get better, but it's not easy.
You said
So-
earlier that scientists don't even agree with each other. Even they don't.
Oh,
And this is
exactly.
literally their thing. I mean, they're the authorities, and they can't agree.
Well, the group of people who work on taxonomy is relatively small. Most science done on corals is not taxonomic.
Uh-huh.
And taxonomy has been sort of underfunded and underappreciated.
Uh,
If you talk to another scientist, they want you to identify the coral form for free. And, if they have hundreds of corals, It's just not feasible. So as part of my job, if people want to send me pictures, I'll do my best to try to identify them. But I always tell people there's lots I can't identify.
Yeah.
And part of them is simply ones that don't have a name yet,
Yeah.
and others that have been synonymized but are actually really separate species.
Yeah.
So it's a whole problem. Let's advance to the next
Sure.
slide. And there's a close-up picture.
Yep.
So a lot of the close-up features are important for identification as well as the whole colonies.
Yep.
I'm reminded of a book on corals. I think it's called Corals of the Pacific or something like that,
Okay.
which the two authors are basically aquarium people.
Uh-huh.
And they have great, wonderful pictures, but most of their pictures are of a whole colony from a distance.
Yes.
And for many of them, I mean, it's in a book, so the pictures are quite small. The picture
Yeah.
is small. The book is small enough to carry on your trip.
Right.
And the pictures are so small that for half of the species, I can't identify whether they're correct or wrong.
Gotcha.
And I found out one picture actually is a sponge, not a coral. And that sort of illustrates the problem.
Right.
And so the difficulty is for amateurs to try to find sources that are reliable. And then the problem is for the few people that actually can do this stuff. And I'm not really funded to do the taxonomy
Sure.
at all. I'm funded to train people.
Yeah.
And in the process, I've got to learn what the taxonomy is and try to keep up with it. Anyhow, so I use a close-up picture, sometimes more than one close-ups, different amounts of close-up,
Yeah.
and at least one picture of the whole colony
Right.
to help people, because you need features of both, I think.
Yeah.
So let's
I
go to
agree.
the next one.
Okay.
And here's the opening slide of one of the practice modules.
Uh-huh.
And let's go to the next slide. And here's
That I
what the-
recognize.
okay, you recognize it, and in a workshop, I've already told people what it is, and I say, "What is it?" And then I push when somebody says an answer, I then push the button. Go ahead and push the button.
Well, I would
And
say Pacillopora damicornis.
I think you're probably pretty good. Push the button and see advance, and there it says, I was doing genera, so Pacillopora, but you're correct. That's probably Damicornis. Unfortunately, there's now 2 or 3 other species that look very similar to Damicornis.
Okay. All right.
And they're not that trivially easy to tell apart.
Okay.
And so anyhow,
Yeah.
that's basically, is that my last slide maybe?
Got this.
Okay,
Your
one
book?
more. That's right. So I have a new book that is just being sent at the moment. It is in the shipping process from the printer to the Maui Ocean Center,
Okay.
which is a public aquarium on Maui in Hawaii,
Yeah.
that sponsored this book. Because presently people are all playing with their smartphones instead of reading books. And so the book market has decreased, and a publisher can't publish it and even break even, let alone make a profit. So anyhow, this is the cover of it, and it covers all the known corals in Hawaii. It's now about 85 species.
Mm-hmm.
There's another 18 species in this book that have not been recognized.
Okay.
They weren't in my first edition. This is a second edition.
Yeah.
And it has lots of things updated, improved now. And there's a new 200-page section on coral biology and coral reef ecology.
Where can we
So,
buy it when it becomes available?
Once it gets to the Maui Ocean Center,
Yep.
I think it will have to be purchased through their gift shop.
Oh, okay.
And
It's just
they
one
have a
location on the planet. Got it.
that's probably, I don't know for sure. It may be that they will list it on Amazon and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
But they will have all the copies. So anyhow,
Okay,
I think
hope
that's
that
my
you
last
made like
slide.
4 billion. There's a lot of people on this planet.
That's right. And there are people outside of Hawaii that are
Right.
interested in learning more corals.
Right.
And the new section on coral biology and ecology has a lot of material in it that aren't in other books. It's a bit farther getting towards the science than some of the other books. So anyhow,
All right.
it will become available.
Nice.
It's not there yet, but
Right.
I expect it to be there by the middle of October, if
Okay.
not earlier.
Let me see if there's another slide. Nope,
I
that's
don't
it.
think so. That's it?
All right, that's it.
Yeah.
That's the end of that. Let me bring this back up. Thank you so much for being on with us. It's 7:05 over here. I guess that's 1:05 your time.
Yep.
You're the first person I've ever spoken to in American Samoa, which is kind of cool. I guess I need to come down there and check out the water and dive with you guys and see if I can identify anything correctly. And I'm going to say probably not. But I would enjoy just getting into the water. I haven't dove in a couple of years. My biggest trip that was super exciting was canceled because of COVID. And,
Yeah.
I need to get recertified because it's been too long since I've worn the BCD. And then get in the water and have a good time.
Basic certification doesn't expire.
Oh, I know, but they always say if it's been more than a year, you should
wanna
just
have
go
a-
through the
have a-
checklist. I need
That's
to do
right,
that.
have a
And double check
little
my
bit.
gear hasn't rotted.
Oh,
sitting in the
that's
closet.
and that's a smart thing to do. No question.
Yeah.
That's right.
I'm going to
Yeah.
let you go. We have to
Yep.
end this one. I see Todd in. Todd in the green room. I'm going to end this live stream, you guys, and then we're going to start a new one for Todd. So thank you so much, Douglas. I really appreciate what you shared with us. I was very curious where that was going to go, and you had a ton to share. You shared so much more than when you sent me the slides. I actually was a little nervous. I was like, wow, there's not much here. And you turned into almost an hour, like without anything. Good job.
That's right. Thank you.
So thank you for being on. And then, of course, we'll keep in communication because of Coral Magazine. All right.
Very good.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to end the stream now, guys.
Thank you.